April 22nd, 1981, in the small town of Standard, Alberta, 15-year-old Kelly Cook had gotten up and was getting ready for school like she did every morning, and is during this rush that she would be surprised by a phone call. Although it was around 8:30 a.m., a call this early was still out of the ordinary. But when she answered, a man's voice would reply. He let her know his name was Bill Christensen, and he was wondering if she would be available to babysit that night around 8:30 p.m. Now that wasn't unusual, as Kelly had been babysitting for quite some time and had a good reputation among parents in the area. However, she was unfamiliar with this man, which was strange because usually people would call and tell her that other parents recommended you to me, or I'm a friend of so-and-so, but Bill could not name anyone. Because of this, she had an abundance of caution and did not give an answer at first, telling the man she would let him know later. When getting off the phone, she would discuss this offer with her mom, who also had no knowledge of a Bill Christensen, which she found odd since this was such a small town with less than 400 people. Her mom advised her to go to school and ask her classmates if they knew a Bill Christensen and what they knew about him. However, this plan did not go over well because Christensen was a pretty common name in the tiny farming community. So some of her classmates said, "Yeah, I know him. He's one of the Christensens," while others told her they had never heard of such a man. Despite not getting anything firm, Kelly now believed that everything was safe, and she would really like to have that extra money. So she accepted, after having a discussion with her mother, of course, who gave her the okay to go. And at 8:30 p.m., the man pulled up and Kelly went out to his car, waving goodbye to her mother and siblings as the so-called Bill Christensen drove off into the night. Meanwhile, Kelly's mother would go back inside and wait, because Kelly was supposed to call upon reaching his home, but that call didn't come in. Her mother at first must have assumed that she was meeting the kids she would be babysitting, and maybe she was still getting used to the environment. But as time slipped away, her mom began to worry. After a few hours with no call, she was getting really scared. Soon, she would make calls all around the small town at a few businesses and residents, trying to find anyone that could put her into contact with Bill Christensen. But nobody knew this man. Things became apparent to her mother now. Something was terribly wrong. By 12:30, she would call the police. The police wasted no time in starting a search either, basically combing the entire area, even stopping every car that came through and searching it, as well as looking into the nearby forest and any barns or sheds they came across. But they found nothing, nor could they trace down anyone that knew of a Christensen, and that would be the way it stood for quite a while. But they would get an answer a few months later, on June 28th, when Kelly's remains were discovered. They were near a lake, about 2.5 hours away from her home. She was left fully clothed, and it didn't look like she had been violated in any way. She had been tied with ropes to concrete blocks where her body had been submerged, and it only surfaced because there had been a drought. Her cause of death, too, was never disclosed, although it's been widely circulated that she had been strangled. Soon, the search for Bill Christensen, which was now assumed to have been a fake name, would begin. Kelly's mom would tell detectives he was about 30 to 45 years old, 5'10", and 180 pounds. He was ugly, with weathered tan skin and a nose with a large bridge. She would finish by stating he had short dark hair and a round face. But she was not the only person to see him. Crazily enough, several people interacted with that guy this day. With this, police were able to make the first sketch of the man. Meanwhile, detectives were running down leads and trying to piece together what exactly happened leading up to this. They were stunned to learn that 3 days prior, this Bill had contacted a 17-year-old girl in town with the same request. This girl had actually declined because she had other plans, and the man would ask her if she knew of any other babysitters, and she recommended Kelly, which is how he even got her phone number. She would also tell investigators she had no idea how this man had even gotten her number, and detectives were not able to trace down where he had even called her from. They did find out later on, though, that he had called a school and talked to a principal, asking if there were any girls that he could suggest to babysit. And finally, he made one phone call from a local hotel bar, which we're going to come back to. But that wasn't all. Soon, a local gas station owner would come forward and stated that a guy fitting the sketch had came into the store that day. This time, he gave a slightly different description, saying that the man was 5'9" with black curly hair, light tan skin, and had the look of a farmer. This led to a second sketch, seen here. This guy would ask to use the phone, and was actually kind of rude about it, but the gas station owner let him use it, and seen him dial a local number, and he overheard him discussing babysitting. But as the conversation was going on, he felt that something was off, but he was unsure what. It was now apparent to investigators that whoever was responsible must have been planning this for a month or two at the least, and it's for that reason that police were never able to really get a good suspect or good person of interest, at least not one they disclosed publicly, although they did investigate 2,200 individuals. But that's not the only strange thing about this one. Oftentimes in cold cases, when there is no traction, rumors begin to swirl. One of these claimed that a man had called the school Kelly attended a month prior to her abduction and inquired about a young figure skater who had been in a local newspaper. Upon talking to school officials, he was actually able to come away with her phone number, whom he then contacted, although, thankfully, the story stops here because apparently nothing happened. But according to the gossip, this caller was most likely the same man who abducted Kelly. Then, there's another source that claimed a man showed up to the funeral home demanding to see Kelly's body, stating that he was a family friend. However, the staff refused to let him enter, and I don't know if that's their official policy or if this guy was just setting off alarm bells, but in either case, he was never identified, and investigators do believe it was Christensen. Today, the overwhelming majority of internet sleuths believe she fell victim to a transient serial killer, and most likely, one from the United States, who may have only traveled over the border for work. However, some believe it was someone local, who obviously chose the name Christensen to gain trust, hoping people would think, oh, he's a cousin, or something to that effect. This is even more likely if it was the same man that called about the figure skater after seeing it in the local paper. He also called from local business phones, like the gas station and hotel bar, not to mention leaving her body at the lake, which is really an irrigation reservoir, and that hints that he was most likely familiar with the area. The negative to this was, no one could identify him, even after a dozen or more people had seen him, which seems unlikely in a town so small. October 10th, 1900, British Columbia. A man named George Gaudereau was standing on the banks of Kootenay Lake when off in the distance something would catch his eye. Staring up the shore, he would see a creature crawl out of the lake and begin going up towards a pile of rotten compost sitting not too far away from the water. Now while this would typically not be anything odd, because it could be a number of animals, this one stood out for one reason. It was about 12 feet in length, which certainly ruled out anything like a beaver. But what really struck George as odd was, this thing looked like an alligator. George would stare on as it would use its small clawed hands and snout to search for food within the compost, eventually giving up and walking back down to the water, where it would get in and swim off. George wasted no time in making his way up to the area where he had seen the beast. When he got there, he would look down to see where the animal had came back up and left, and there was a trail of webbed tracks in the sand. George was flabbergasted, and soon told friends and neighbors, and before long, the story spread. Soon after this, everyone was talking about the Canadian alligator, and not only that, but it began popping up in other areas, like Fraser River, Cultus Lake, and most importantly, Pitt Lake, which we will come back to. The descriptions were quite similar, usually between 5 to 10 feet long, with a 12-inch snout and dark skin that was mostly smooth except for a few patches that appeared to be bumpy. The creature walked on 4 legs that were about 10 inches long and had 4 webbed feet and stubby nails. Although sightings remained ongoing for some time, the whole thing did die down eventually, until the next big sighting took place years later in 1915, this time in Hope, British Columbia, close to 400 miles away, and it involved 3 witnesses, a Charles Flood, Green Hicks, and Donald McCrae, who would come up on a small lake. The record does not state what they were doing when they stumbled up onto it, but it doesn't really matter. What's important is in this lake were animals that looked like baby alligators, just a few inches long. swimming around in the mud. They were all solid black in color, which struck the men as odd. Unfortunately, they had no containers, nor a net to scoop the little things up, so they eventually left, went back to town, and told their friends about it. This would be all of the Canadian alligator for close to 6 decades, as it had largely become a footnote when the third sighting would take place on the area I mentioned earlier, Pitt Lake. It was on June 3rd in 1973 when a Warren and Sharon Scott were standing on the shore and would catch a sight that they never expected in the cold waters of Canada. There, out in the water, were a large number of huge reptiles grouped together, slowly swimming by. While the two were trying to figure out what it was they had just seen, something else caught their eye. Next to the bank were 3 smaller creatures, just a few inches long. Warren assumed they were the babies of whatever had just passed by and got down in the water and scooped them up. This time, there was a container and all 3 were kept. Here's where it gets weirder though. 2 of the 3 that were kept, we have no idea what happened to, as that story has been lost to time. But the third one was actually sent to the nearby Simon Fraser University Biology Department, where it would be studied. However, whatever happened with this specimen and the research of it was also lost to time. But it was this sighting that gave the cryptid its new moniker, that of the Pitt Lake Lizard. And basically, sightings have continued in Pitt Lake ever since, even if it's just sporadically. But the most recent credible sighting took place in 2002 by a man named Dan Garrick, a local wildlife expert. On 2 separate occasions, he spotted a creature over 5 feet long with very dark skin that was pretty smooth. He described it as looking more like an oversized salamander rather than an alligator. But what were people really seeing? If it was an alligator, how did it survive the cold temperatures? Which brings us to the more plausible theory, one where we go back to Dan Garrick's assessment. What if it was really just an undiscovered giant salamander? And before you think that is crazy, consider the biggest species, that of the South China giant salamander, which can grow up to 6.5 feet long, which is in the area at the 5 to 10 feet people said they were seeing. They are also typically dark, which again matches the description, and they can live up to 80 years old, which fits the timeline for all the original sightings, although the modern sightings would still be unexplained. But they are not native to Canada, although it doesn't mean someone else couldn't have brought it over as a pet and got rid of it later on. But what if there was a Canadian version of the giant salamander? Well, there is, but it's nowhere near as big. It's called the Pacific giant salamander, and it can get up to about 1 foot long, which leaves us with the possibility that Canada might have an undiscovered giant salamander. Not the most exciting cryptid mystery, but possibly the most realistic. July 2nd, 1975, Moncton, New Brunswick. A 7-year-old, Michelle Wedge, was out riding her bicycle around the home. Her parents were both away for the evening, but they had entrusted Michelle with their older siblings, which was not untypical or uncommon for this time. But it would end up being a decision the family would regret forever, because that evening, Michelle's older sister would leave the home, while her older brother would invite his friends over to play, leaving the young Michelle to ride around the home at dusk with no supervision, which typically would not be anything to be scared over in this small town. But it would be when Michelle's older sister arrived back home at 9 that this oversight would turn tragic, because when she arrived home, she did not see Michelle on her bike. She was not in the yard, nor anywhere in the neighborhood. Alarmed, she went inside to look for her to see she was gone, and asked her brother where Michelle was. He had assumed she was still in the yard. This is when alarm bells went off, because he would tell his older sister the last time he had seen her was at 8:30. Suffice to say, the police were called, although I'm unsure if this happened immediately or after her parents got home. Regardless, the RCMP would show up and began to canvass the small neighborhood and ask questions, and they quickly established a timeline as well as a path Michelle had taken. They found out from various neighbors that about 9:10 p.m., 40 minutes after her brother had last seen her, she was riding her bicycle up the street and had made it a few homes away. Interestingly, it was during this initial search that her brother found her bicycle at an intersection. The case now had an ominous feeling, and the possibility of an abduction arose. The anxiety only increased when 2 more witnesses came forward. both young girls, who stated they had seen Michelle get into the car with a man who had tried to get them to get in the car earlier that night. They would give his description that soon led to a sketch. They stated he was in his mid to late 20s, with thick black hair and eyebrows, a dark complexion, with a scar on the right side of his face. He had a full beard, thin mustache, with dark thick rimmed glasses. He also spoke to the girls with a voice they found strange. They said the vehicle was a small dark green car with a black interior, and some sources say that the girls told him he might be in his late 30s and walk with a slight limp. Now this man, and this description, sounds awfully strange, and that might be why detectives were skeptical about these two girls that came forward. Not that investigators may have outright believed they were lying, but they found the accounts a little confusing. The man seemed to be very distinctive and should stick out like a sore thumb, and he did. Because it didn't take detectives long to trace him down, they found a man that was very close to the description, and they interrogated him and released him. Although I could not find out much about this individual, it seemed like the police didn't think it was him, which again, might be why they doubted the two girls to begin with. Although there would be more witnesses that came forward later and corroborated the part about the car at least, but they could not see the driver. In any event, the RCMP would never list Michelle's case as an abduction, instead still listing her as a missing person to this day. Part of that's because of the accounts of the girls that they don't deem reliable, as well as the fact there just was never any proof she was abducted. They even tracked down the main suspect and were able to rule him out quickly. But strangely, just a year prior in St. John, about 100 miles away, a very similar case occurred when a 5-year-old, Shirley Milbury, was walking alone at dusk in the early summer, just like Michelle, when she vanished. Also, they share the fact that both disappearances occurred near a convenience store. Her remains were eventually found. She had been violated by the man. Since then, many online sleuths have tried to draw a connection between the two cases. Although the police still classify her as missing and not abduction, most investigators do believe she was abducted, and it may have involved more than one person. They have actually stated within the past few years that they have evidence now pointing to a crime, but they have refused to speak about it. When it comes to cases of unexplained phenomena, UFO encounters are always near the top, with numerous sightings reported a year, which inevitably leads to a mixed bag of stories, with many being too ludicrous to believe, or in many cases, just comes down to one person's account. But what about UFO encounters where many people see it? These are special since it can add credibility to a case, especially when the people don't know each other. That's exactly what would happen in the Yukon on December 11th, 1996, in a UFO case that would see 20 plus people call in to report strange lights in the skies. The first two witnesses to spot and report the craft were driving down the Klondike Highway next to Fox Lake when they seen a huge UFO hovering over the ice. And what's interesting about this is these two witnesses were not traveling together, but instead driving separately. Yet they were cousins. Regardless, they pulled off to the side of the road to get a better look, and that's when one of the men got out and walked a little ways to get a better look, and the UFO started moving towards him, hovering directly over him and across the highway. It would keep moving until it slowly disappeared behind a hill to the east. One of these witnesses would draw a few sketches, which has since been used to make a computer-generated one. While this was going on, we would get our next set of witnesses, a couple with a small child, who were in another vehicle traveling along the same route on the highway when they would see a huge row, or rows of lights, moving across the lake. They at first thought it was a large truck off in the distance, but soon realized that the lights were over the lake, ruling out a truck. Then, their hearts sank as they soon began to think it was a jet making a crash landing. But then they were able to rule that out because this craft was moving too slow. Then it dawned on them, this was a UFO. They started to slow down, seeing how they were driving right towards that area. But after a few minutes, they could no longer see the craft as it drifted off into the distance. And as they drove a little bit further up the road, they would see the first witnesses pulled over on the side, looking up into the sky, prompting the family to pull over and talk to the other witnesses and compare notes, before finally driving off and stopping at a lodge, where they would stop and talk to the owner, a man named Steve Watson, and they would tell them what they had just seen, only to find out Another driver had stopped in before to tell the same story. In their account, which had happened 30 minutes prior, he again was driving near the lake when he saw a light in the distance, one in which he continued to follow throughout the sky. He would eventually see it moving behind the same hill where it disappeared. He tried speeding up to locate it, but it was gone. He even got out of his vehicle to look around and still could not spot it. But he did leave behind a description. The final account of this first set of sightings would be a woman who again was driving through the same area and seeing the same lights. This time, the only difference in the report was she stated her interior lights started to get dim and her tape deck slowed down. Now crazily enough, while all this was going on, about a 2-hour drive up the highway at the village of Pelly Crossing, a trapper was out checking his line when in the distance to the southwest, the direction of Fox Lake, he seen a long row of lights moving slowly towards the area. He too at first thought it was an airliner about to make a crash landing, but after he studied it for a second, he realized it was a UFO. He covered his flashlight out of fear, which stopped the UFO for a second before it zoomed up to just a few yards ahead of him, and a light came out from the bottom and started searching the ground before it just moved on. It made no sound, and the light was a greenish phosphorescent beam. The witness then ran across a small clearing and looked back to see if the craft was gone. While that was going on, 2 more witnesses traveling down the highway noticed these same lights, and they pulled over and got out to watch and seen it tracking off in the distance. But there were even more accounts. 4 community college students would walk out onto the front deck of the university building and look towards the western sky to see the same lights moving over with no sound. And this keeps going on, with 4 additional witnesses calling from the highway to report seeing the lights moving across the night sky, while 4 other men also pulled to the side of the highway to stop and watch the lights moving. And to keep from sounding like a broken record, we will stop here. But in total, there were 20 plus people that called that night with similar descriptions. Now unfortunately, this was 1996, and almost nobody was carrying around a camera, so there is no video evidence. However, how do you dispute 20 plus witnesses who seemingly did not know each other for the most part? Well, let's get to the obvious. Did you notice I didn't list any of the names of the witnesses? I don't know how important that is, but from what I can find, none of the witnesses' names were ever disclosed. Apparently, they asked to have their names removed. That might cast some doubt on it, but it's possible they just didn't want to be bothered by UFO enthusiasts. But if these accounts were real, and they seem to be, how do you explain it? Even when the witnesses were spread out over 130 miles. Unsurprisingly, skeptics are unconvinced. The Skeptical Inquirer actually did a whole feature on this event, and they believed it had a simple explanation. The satellite, Russian Cosmos 2335, had actually been launched into orbit earlier that day, and this thing that everyone's seen was the discarded second stage booster breaking up on re-entry. In fact, there was some research done that showed the trajectory of this orbital decay, and it would have put it directly over the Yukon that night. Also, it would have produced slow, steady movement of changing patterns of light due to the burning debris, and would have been seen over a wide distance. Of course, that doesn't explain everything, like the UFO allegedly reacting to one of the witnesses' flashlight, or hovering in place. That's why some still believe that what happened that night was a true UFO encounter. (1809), Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. A retired surgeon for the British Army, Richard Fletcher, was working on his land near a salt pond. This pond had actually been walled off 9 years prior in an effort to create a salt marsh, and it's probably that action that will lead to this intriguing discovery, because near the water, Fletcher saw a curious stone in the mud, one that he knew he needed to investigate further. The measurements were about 31 inches by 20 inches by 13, and weighed close to 400 pounds, and what stuck out to Fletcher was an inscription at the top that he had no idea how to read. The markings were between 1 and 1.5 inches. Now curiously, the stone did not look like it had been altered in any other way. It was still in its natural state, other than the inscription. At first, he didn't really know what to do with this stone. This was the early 19th century in Canada, and it's not like the area was rife with museums. So at first, he kinda just left it there, until 3 years later, in 1812, when he would tell residents in town about it. and over the next few years, people from town and out of town would go by to check it out. Years later in 1819, Fletcher would pass away, and the stone still stood as a small tourist attraction in the area, and it would remain that way for the next 60 years, until the town, realizing they had an interesting piece of history, decided to move it inside the city limits itself. And it's after this move, a provincial government official who just happened to be in town for some work, seen the stone and made arrangements for it to be sent to the Provincial Museum in Halifax. But because of a clerical error, it was never shipped, and it remained in the town, where it finally found its way into the Yarmouth County Museum, where it still sits today. Having explained its origin, we still have the mystery. What the heck does that inscription say? And even more perplexing, who left it? Well, that's where the theories come in, and some of them are obvious, and others not so much. It should be of no surprise to anyone who has watched the pre-Columbian series that the first big theory was that they were Viking inscriptions. One of the earliest papers published about the stone claimed it was runic, and it translated to Hako son addressed the men. Hako being one of the men who accompanied Thorfinn Karlsefni on his expedition to Vinland, aka Canada, most likely 1007 AD, which is why someone would later write 1007 on the stone. This was somewhat disputed by another Viking expert who claimed that the inscription was actually left by Leif Erikson, the first European to step foot in North America in 1000 AD. This time, the inscription was supposed to have been a tribute to his father. And it is worth pointing out, the whole Vikings landing in Canada was still just a theory at this point, and one not universally accepted. That didn't come until the 1960s when official archaeological proof was discovered. It was because of this that many scholars of the time began arguing over these inscriptions, and they claimed people were just making up whatever they wanted it to say, and then claiming the Vikings had did it. Before long, rune experts came in to study the stone, and they were able to rule that it was not Viking at all, with at least one expert suggesting that it may have been left by the early English colonists. Although he didn't know why, he suggested that it was more than likely someone's attempt at a hoax, or perhaps they were just bored. However, it was still deemed interesting enough that the stone would continue to be studied, but no solid conclusions were ever reached. In 1943, a Nova Scotia archaeologist, A.D. Fraser, would study the stone, and he believed he had seen signs that a saw had been used, and he believed it was left by the indigenous people. As to what it said, well, he thought it was most likely someone just goofing around, and the text said nothing. This didn't stop more theories though, and by the early 1990s, there was still a dispute over the true origin of the inscription. Some still believed the Vikings, others believed the indigenous people, while even more suggested the English. But now, other crazier theories were coming in, like the Welsh, the Mayans, and even the Hungarians. Interestingly, two other stones were supposed to have been seen about 7 miles away at the mouth of the Tusket River. There on an island were two large stones with inscriptions similar to that of the Fletcher stone. This was found in two different sources, one being a letter published by the Nova Scotian Institute of Science. However, these stones' locations were never officially documented and therefore lost for the time being. But back to the Fletcher stone, how can you name it after the man that discovered it? And not suggest he was the one that hoaxed it. That's right, Dr. Fletcher is also one of the theories. Some sources claim he was known as a practical joker. It's also sketchy that he left it there in the mud for 3 years after he found it, before he finally told all the other residents. Not to mention, his descendants would claim later on he told them he carved the stone himself. These are the more normal theories, but as I mentioned, there are some a little more out there, like some who suggest that the inscription was early Basque, a culture whose origin is near the border of France and Spain. They did eventually monopolize the whale trade and did most of their hunting off the coast of Nova Scotia some years later, so this one is not as far-fetched. But the claim that the inscriptions say that the Basque people subdued this land is a little too ambitious. Then, there is the claim that it's ancient Mycenaean script, the late Bronze Age Greek civilization that thrived 3,000 years ago, meaning that one's highly doubtful, but maybe not as doubtful as the claim that it was left by Japanese explorers, or it was meant to mark the death of a beloved warrior. Finally, there are some who believe that this is nothing more than a random weathering pattern. August 29th, 1884, in the waters between Baccalieu Island and Catalina, off the coast of Newfoundland, the HMS Mallard, captained by Lieutenant William L. H. Brown, was patrolling the area tasked by the Royal Navy with the job of enforcing fishing treaties, and it was here he would become alerted to a mysterious ship in the distance, setting about 25 miles from Catalina. Its sails were set, but it was drifting around the water in a chaotic manner, something that obviously struck the veteran captain as odd. He would give the orders to his men to sail closer and get a better look. As they were brought in closer, they recognized it was a merchant ship, named the Resolven, captained by John James. It had actually showed up 2 months ago from the Mediterranean, carrying a load of salt, but its last assignment started just 3 days ago, when it was deployed to go pick up a shipment of cod from Labrador, where it was then taken back to Europe. The Mallard continued to approach, hoping the men above the Resolven had just temporarily lost control of the ship, but as they got closer, they seen no obvious reason as to why the ship was moving around so erratically. They would call out to the men, and then began to signal with their lights, but there was no reply. Captain Brown was stumped, and he ordered a boarding party to go investigate. When the men arrived on board, they did not see anything out of the ordinary just yet. The lamps were lit, and a fire was still burning in the galley, and food was still on the table. But after further exploring the ship, they realized that no one was on board. This prompted the party to do a more in-depth investigation, where they soon found the ship had a broken yard, but other than that, it had only suffered superficial damage. Obviously, the next logical thing to look for was the lifeboat, and to no surprise, it was missing. Actually, some of the damage to the ship looked as if the crew may have done it intentionally as a way to launch the lifeboat away easier, but there was no explanation as to why the men had fled, because the ship was still serviceable. Interestingly, they did find the logbook on board, and it had just been updated within the past 6 hours. None of this made sense, yet the 11 people on board, 7 crewmen and 4 passengers, were all gone. The investigating party, not knowing what else to do, would go back to the Mallard and inform Captain Brown, and Brown was sort of perplexed on what to do next, but he would have the ship anchor and wait, thinking the crew may come back at some point, and then he could possibly offer help, or at least see if everything was okay. But as time passed and the men never returned, his thinking turned to, well, a passing ship probably came by and picked them up, so the Resolven was towed back to port, yet those 11 people on board were never seen again, which leaves the mystery. What happened? Well, this case is unsurprisingly went on to become known as the Welsh version of the Mary Celeste, since it had been built in Wales. And really, there's not a lot of good theories. The main one, though, was that the crew was not accustomed to northern waters, and after glancing off an iceberg and taking a little bit of damage, they panicked and lowered the lifeboat, and did so in such a haste that the boat was swamped, or it drifted away completely. They may have not run into an iceberg at all and just seen one. In either case, they panicked and fled the boat. But the problem with this one was, there was no sign of that. There were no bodies or debris or anything that suggested such a thing had occurred. However, the crew of the Mallard did note that there was a large iceberg in the area when all this happened, but it would not seem likely that the men would all abandon a ship that was still seaworthy just because it had taken slight damage. But there's other stories around this one too, though, or you may say, legends, that point to a different cause, maybe something like piracy. First, let's go back to the people on board, 7 crewmen and 4 passengers. Why would passengers be on a merchant ship? The story has always been that 4 local men had asked the captain for a ride before the Resolven left Newfoundland. So could it be that these 4 men might have been responsible for whatever had happened? In fact, there were rumors that Captain John James was carrying a stash of gold coins on board inside the captain's quarters, which the crew of the Mallard didn't see. The captain was also known to wear a rare and valuable white gold watch, which had also disappeared. Is it possible these 4 passengers had heard about the gold when they were on shore? Or maybe one of the men on the Resolven was in on it with them? It's hard to say, since it could have just been an old sailor's tale, but it's not the only one. There is another account from 2 brothers in a small fishing village who claimed to have found a dead man in a captain's uniform sitting under a tree on a remote outcrop of Newfoundland just a few weeks after the Resolven was found. They gave him a proper burial in an unmarked grave. That has never been found. But supposedly, these two men that found the body then came into a huge fortune of gold. So again, a lot of this sounds too fanciful to be real, and it's difficult to say exactly what, if any of this happened. Not to mention, there was no sign of a struggle or blood on the deck, and it might be difficult for a crew of 4 to overpower 8. January 23rd, 1992, Edmonton. 19-year-old University of Alberta student Dean Curtis Mortensen decided to tag along with some friends to a student pub known in the area as a big hangout. Now Dean wasn't much of a drinker. In fact, he rarely did, but one must imagine he was simply looking to kill some time, or maybe he just wanted to fit in. In either case, he would have a couple of shots with his friends before they all left the bar around midnight. Luckily for the young men, their dorms were very close, easily within 300 feet, and sources online say it typically takes a 6-minute walk. But as they are making their ways across the lawn, one of his friends soon realizes he left something back at the pub, perhaps a wallet or something of that nature. So he told the others he was going to run back and get it, which prompts the other friends to just tag along with him. And I have to clarify here, the number of friends varies depending on the source. Some say 1, some say 2, others say 4 or more. Anyways, for whatever reason, Dean decides to wait on them, and after 2 to 3 minutes, the other boys came back, only to see Dean was gone. They probably assumed he decided to forego the cold temperature, listed as -10 Celsius, or in Fahrenheit, 14 degrees. In any case, the friends went back to the dorms themselves, not thinking much of it, until the next morning, when another friend, who had not been with them the night before, knocked on Dean's door on his way to class. Since the two typically walked together, after waiting a few minutes with no reply, he began to suspect that Dean was just going to sleep in, so he stopped knocking and went on his way. But as the day wore on and he had still not heard from Dean, he got concerned, and his friend, Stephen Berland, went looking for him again around 1 p.m., and after no answer of repeated knocks on the door, Stephen knew he had to get inside, and he soon did, and what he walked in on was nothing unusual. In fact, everything was perfectly normal. The bed was even made, like Dean did every morning, one of the few students who did. Stephen was confused, but he knew although everything appeared to be okay, something was wrong, so he went to the police to report it. This would obviously start a search where police canvassed the area. They questioned numerous students, including his friends from the night before, and they were just as confused as Stephen. Upon relaying the stories to detectives, and I'm sure after they were thoroughly investigated, law enforcement were left with little in what they could do. But it seems like they didn't think any of the friends were involved, and instead, they believed Dean had simply wandered off, and their hunch was right, maybe, because a week later, Dean's dark blue St. Joe Ranger's hat was found in the area. Actually, it was in the backyard of a local resident, but what was really eerie was it was very close to a local landmark, the High Level Bridge, which goes over the North Saskatchewan River, about a 20-minute walk from the school. This left family and friends mortified, and to make matters worse, that's the only trace of Dean that has popped up in the 3 decades since. But investigators now had an easy answer to the case, right? He ended his own life. It's the only thing that made sense. One of the lead investigators would even note that his belief was that something inside Dean had snapped. Maybe the stress of school that was then amplified by alcohol, leading to him deciding to end it. While one report stated investigators were concerned because of Dean's background, which they never elaborated on. But there were issues with this theory. First of all, Dean's friends, plus witnesses from the bar, stated Dean wasn't heavily intoxicated. In fact, he didn't even seem like he was buzzed. Likewise, an in-depth search into his life revealed he was not having any issues. His friends and family all reported that he was not depressed or stressed about anything. In fact, he was excited about the future. Maybe the biggest issue with this theory, though, was the river was likely frozen, and if he had jumped and went through the ice, there should have at the very least been some blood, or maybe still cracks in the ice from where he had went through. This led others to speculate that maybe he had an accident instead, which is very plausible since the area around the river does seem to have steep drops dense brush, wildlife, and even the occasional assault. Just like the first theory, there seems to be many things going against this. For example, witnesses stated he could have not been that drunk, recalling how cognizant he was acting when they had seen him. But let's just speculate that maybe he was more drunk than they thought, and he passed out somewhere and froze to death, which would have been easy to do on this night. But if so, how come a body wasn't recovered? How far could he have gotten? I mean, he was on a university campus, so there were issues to this theory too. There are more, but they have the same issues, like the belief that Dean left on his own to start a new life, leaving his hat behind as a sign, or maybe even to suggest that he had drowned in the river so nobody would spend time searching for him. But considering he left the equivalent of about $7,000 behind, it doesn't seem likely. The same goes for the foul play theory. There were no signs of a struggle, not even around the hat, nor did anyone report seeing anything suspicious. Before we finish theories though, it's important to point out the most important piece of evidence is actually that hat. Many have pointed out on how it took over a week to find it in the backyard of a resident. It seems like that someone would have seen it before then, which has led to wild conjecture, like the killer returned and planted the hat, but it's just as likely the wind blew it there, or maybe an animal drug it to that location, or maybe it really just hadn't been spotted. But there's another thought altogether, that this hat is not even Dean's in the first place, and it's just a matching hat that someone else happened to own. I don't know what the odds of that is, but I would say it's conceivable, just not likely. There's also the strange fact that Dean didn't accompany his friends back to the bar to pick up the forgotten item, and it's led many to suggest that his friends were not as innocent as they seemed. But from what I can find, the investigators never named them as suspects, or even persons of interest. One final little thing to note was there was never any missing person posters hung up, and basically the story went away very quickly, disappearing from the news within just a few months, and police seemingly marking it as a cold case and moving on. November 20th, 1902, Fort William, Ontario. Captain George R. Wood was guiding the ship Bannockburn over Lake Superior and on its way to Georgian Bay. Although young for a captain at just 37 years old, Wood was a good seaman and had basically the equivalent experience of many other captains his age, although the same could not be said for the rest of his crew, where the other 19 young men were between 17 and 20 years old. But it was a good paying job that got the youths away from their parents, so for many, it was an easy decision to sign up for the job. The men's task was to deliver 85,000 bushels of wheat before the close of shipping season, as winter was around the corner and lake shipping would be stopped. And in a sign of bad things to come, before the Bannockburn could even get out into the open lake, she would run aground. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the ship had to turn back to port to be inspected. A quick look over revealed no major damage, and the Bannockburn would resume her job the very next day, and everything would start off pretty normal. And later in the morning, another lake freighter, the Algonquin, captained by James McMath, would use his binoculars to see Bannockburn sailing by about 7 miles southeast of him. Since he had seen the Bannockburn many times, he knew for sure it was the ship, and he would pull up his binoculars every few seconds to keep checking in on it, before finally looking up the last time to see it had disappeared, presumably into the fog. As the day wore on, the winter weather the men had hoped to beat arrived early. It got extremely cold, and the snow was coming down hard. Ice had now formed, and massive chunks of it crashed into one another and into the shore. Every ship on the lake that night would be challenged, but it wasn't nothing they had not seen before. In fact, about this same time, a passenger ship, the Huron, would sail by a ship they believed to be the Bannockburn, although it was difficult to see, and they could tell the crew of the young men were handling the storm with no issue. The next morning the Bannockburn was expected to arrive at the Sioux Locks, but it didn't. And at first, this was not really alarming, because considering the weather from the night before, many of the ships were late for their destination. But as the day progressed, and it didn't show up, a little worry did set in. This only got worse when several days passed without one sign of the Bannockburn. Trying to keep a panic from starting, and maybe the bad press, everything was kept quiet until the families, who were by this point very worried, began putting pressure onto the shipping company, and their worries were soon subsided because the manager for the Montreal Transportation Company, a Mr. L.L. Henderson, would tell the press he had received a wire from a Chicago office that was providing insurance coverage for the ship, and they stated the Bannockburn had been located on the north shore of Lake Superior opposite Machipicoten Island, and the crew were safe. So the families were relieved. Their loved ones, the majority under 20 years old, would be coming back home. Except that was not the truth. It seems that L.L. Henderson may have just been trying to buy more time for the shipping company to go investigate, because he would later be forced to admit he made his statement based upon nothing more than another freighter who claimed to have seen the Bannockburn safely anchored at that location, yet he obviously could not confirm that. But this insurance company, as you might imagine, were not in a hurry to actually cover anything, and they instead believed that the Bannockburn had become stranded on Caribou Island because the lighthouse there had been turned off a week prior. So their theory was Captain Wood may have been looking for that light during the storm, only to strike the dangerous reef which surrounded the island, and then become stranded. Of course, this may have just been the insurance company's way of being totally useless. By this time, another ship, the Frank Rockefeller, would hear of the news, and they would come forward to report their finding. They had actually passed through a debris field on November 25th, which surprised them obviously, because at the time, they had not heard about the Bannockburn. 5 days later, it was painfully obvious. The Bannockburn had crashed, and all the men on board were declared lost. It would be 2 weeks later on December 12th that the only item from the ship would be recovered, and it was a blood-stained cork life preserver, basically the precursor to the modern life jacket. It actually washed up on a beach and was found by the captain of another ship. Obviously, we know the ship sank, but why did it? That's the mystery. And basically ever since the crash, investigators and enthusiasts have offered up an abundance of theories. One of the earliest was a boiler explosion, but no other ships in the area reported hearing one, and there was never a sign of charred wreckage. Another theory involves an area called Superior Shoal, which although known at the time by many fishermen, was not officially charted, so it's possible they ran up onto the reef there and took on water, and the inexperienced crew turned back towards the deeper water and sunk, although that doesn't make sense either. Interestingly, the Sioux locks were drained at the end of the season, and a hull plate was discovered. For some reason, some people thought it might be the Bannockburns, but that was never confirmed. But if it was, it would mean that the ship had a very critical weak point that, with just a little damage, would sink quickly. It is worth noting that many of the ships on the lake that night reported that this was the worst storm of the season, with some of the ships taking light damage themselves. The lake storms can produce waves up to 30 feet and could have sunk the men and ship quickly. Not to mention, there were reports from other ships about floating ice that night. Finally, I have to note that even though it's officially the last time it was ever seen, shortly after the events, and up till today, people claim to have seen the ghost ship of Bannockburn still trying to deliver its shipment of wheat, and it's went on to earn the moniker Flying Dutchman of the Great Lakes. March 23rd, 1977, Sherbrooke, Quebec. 20-year-old Louise Camirand was spending the evening with her fiancé, a man named Daniel Braun. The two had actually met through their service in the Sherbrooke Hussars, which is an armored regiment of the Canadian National Reserves. The courtship had actually went pretty quickly, and the two were excited about their future lives together. By about 3 p.m., Daniel would leave, as he had to go to the armory, but he planned to meet back up with Louise that night. In the meantime, she would go hang out with one of her best friends. She would spend the evening there until about 9:30 that night, when Louise would leave to go buy some cigarettes and then go meet up with Daniel at the armory. However, she never arrived, which was unlike her. Daniel, sensing something was wrong, began calling her apartment at 10:30, thinking maybe she had changed her mind about meeting, or that she had got tired, or something like that. But she didn't answer the phone, and his worry began to increase. He would continue using the armory phone, trying to get a hold of her, but at 1:15 a.m., when she still did not pick up, he would ask a friend to take him to her apartment, and he was shocked when he got there, but not for the reason you think. Instead, it looked exactly like it was when he had left earlier that day. The only difference was her purse and boots were gone, while her glasses remained on the counter, which made him wonder, was she out looking for him now? Had he just missed her? Sadly for Daniel, that was not the case, and he, along with her family, began searching for her and notifying police. But they were not able to find her, at least not yet. It would actually be the following day when Louise's nude body was found on a snow embankment, about 20 minutes from her apartment. She had been strangled with a bootlace. Because her body had been found so quickly, the coroner was also able to discern other injuries, like internal ones. He stated that she had been stomped on, along with being violated in a very fierce manner. Curiously, investigators were confident that it did not take place here in the snow, and instead, they believed she had been abducted and taken somewhere, and then dumped here. And although she had been left nude, for some reason, one glove remained on her hand, and her pants and jacket were left beside her body. Meanwhile, her blouse, boots, purse, and most of her jewelry, other than her engagement ring, were missing and never found. Now, this snow embankment was actually in the forest near a lake, on a back road that most people would never travel or even know about. So investigators were sure that this individual was very familiar with the area, as they couldn't believe he had just stumbled across it and then used it as a place to get rid of a body. They would also speak to a clerk who worked at a convenience store and seen Louise the night she came in to get cigarettes. She would linger around the newspaper rack, flipping through magazines for a few minutes before she bought her cigarettes and milk and exited the store. This was the last time she was seen alive. Over the next half a year, detectives would interview more than 250 people that they thought might be involved, or at the very least, know someone that was, but they got nothing, not one lead. In the meantime, though, they did begin a search for a car with a 44-inch separation between the tires, because that is what was left in the snow. They knew it belonged to a select few models of cars, so they asked the public to come forward to report anyone they knew that had been driving one, and this too led to nothing. Now, one of the things that has plagued this case from the get-go was the police themselves. In 1977, Quebec had the highest murder rate in all of Canada, and to make matters worse, they also had the lowest percentage of solved murder cases for the entire country over the 1970s. But the investigators did have one hunch, and it's the obvious suspect that is always looked at first: her fiancé, Daniel. Of course, they brought him in and interrogated him, but he had an ironclad alibi, not to mention no motive. He was crazy about Louise and was excited about their upcoming marriage, not to mention her own family came to his defense. Detectives knew they had to look elsewhere. Soon, they began to look at the armory itself. What if someone from the same regiment was just jealous? In fact, the military-style bootlace left on Louise's neck indicated that it was someone with military boots. Unfortunately, Louise had been wearing those same type boots that night, and they were now missing. So it's unsure if the lace was hers or from the killer. Detectives were not sure either, but it did pique their interest in one man from the armory. His name was Raymond Roy. He had actually dated Louise some 4 years prior to Daniel, but she would break it off with him when he was out of town attending college. From there, she began dating Daniel, and as we mentioned, that relationship developed super quickly. And just 2 weeks prior to her murder, Roy went to her apartment on 2 occasions, where he was seen and heard by multiple other tenants standing at the entrance arguing with her, loud arguments, after she turned down his sexual advances and told him to go away. So he had a motive, and considering the murder seemed like one of a great passion, it was obvious, right? But investigators didn't feel that way. After a brief interrogation, they felt they could safely rule him out. But if it was not him, then who? Well, that brings up the whole interesting theory in this case that has never been 100% confirmed by law enforcement. But see, Louise's murder was the first of a series now attributed to a man known as the Bootlace Killer, an alleged serial killer that operated in the eastern townships and Montreal in the 70s. After her murder, 3 more murders in similar profiles were committed. Helen Monast, 18 years old, Denise Bazinet, 23 years old, Teresa Allure, 19 years old, and Lizanne Bless, 17 years old, all murdered between 1977 and 1978, all by use of a bootlace, shoelace, or scarf. All 4 of the women were living what was considered a low-risk lifestyle. No drugs or prostitution or anything like that. All found in a wooded or rural setting. Clothing was taken while jewelry on the body was usually left on. And, oftentimes, the body was staged. Interestingly, because of the poor police work, no one ever thought of a serial killer until the early 2000s, and by that point, it was hard to investigate. But with new technology and new eyes looking at the case, cold case detectives began to wonder, were there others? In fact, they would end up finding 3 more unsolved murders that they felt had a good possibility of being connected, but they couldn't rule out that there were even more victims. To this day, though, they have still been hesitant to definitively say that there was a serial killer operating over the years of 1977 and 1978, if not longer. But some still believe that they botched the original investigation, and it was obviously the ex, Raymond Roy. June 16th, 1659, Quebec City, in what was then New France. A ship would touch shore, bringing more French immigrants to settle the very tiny colony, which at this point was about 1,700 people. And getting off this ship was a young 14-year-old girl named Barbe Hallay. Her father had actually came to the colony some 3 years prior and was now bringing his family over, who all hoped at a shot at a better life. Barbe, in particular, would soon find employment as a servant, where she would do many of the typical, quote, women chores, like cooking, cleaning, and washing, but she also did work with the farm animals and garden. But it's one day when she was attending to these chores that she heard a knock at the door. Barbe, being the servant, went to see who was there, and when she opened it, she was met by a man named Daniel Vu. Daniel would tell Barbe he had come to ask for her hand in marriage, because apparently he had already made a deal with her father that in exchange for land, he could marry her. But see, Daniel didn't have the best reputation in town. First of all, he was dishonest, and he was known to have a short temper. And maybe worst of all, he was a Protestant, much to Barbe's dismay, since she was actually Catholic and on her way to joining a religious order, presumably a nun, although I could never find confirmation. And since Barbe was considered the age of consent, she had actually had the legal right to refuse the proposal in spite of what her father had offered, and she did just that. And Daniel got really upset about this, and he stormed off in anger, and he wouldn't leave it at just that. He wanted to force her to marry him. Now what happened next is lost to history, but what eventually would happen is he would reach out to some of his shadier connections, like witches, magicians, or any of the occult figures in the early colony that Daniel was said to hang around with. He would ask these people for help, or he conspired with them to conjure up an entity to terrorize Barbe into marrying him. As ridiculous as this sounds, this whole account was recorded by Marie of the Incarnation, a nun who has since been declared a saint due to her work for Catholicism, particularly in New France. And what's really crazy is, bad stuff started to happen to Barbe. Marie would straight up record that she was vexed with demons, while other records from the time cited that she had become afflicted with malfeasance. Several people that visited the home would confirm some of the weird things that were happening, like flutes and drums playing by themselves, pieces of stone coming off of the masonry from the home and flying across the room. Barbe would begin to complain of seeing phantoms at day and night, appearing as men, children, beasts, or demons. Sometimes it was Daniel himself who appeared to her. Before long, the news spread, and a bishop, Francois de Laval, would send priests to exorcise the demon, which would be the first time in Canadian history. But when these priests failed, he went to do it himself, and he failed too. But now, he would set out to get proof that Daniel had been the source of this satanic possession, and after some political back and forth, the case against Daniel was brought forward. He was arrested in September 1660, and after a trial in October 1661, he was found guilty and executed. This is part of historical record, and you can look it up, but there is some dispute over if this execution was really due to putting a demon on Barbe, because some sources claim he was really executed for trading liquor to the local Iroquois, and it had nothing to do with witchcraft, but seemingly no one else was ever executed for the liquor trade. Most were just banished or punished in some other way, so that part's confusing too. Regardless, Barbe's demon possession did not stop. She eventually ended up at a hospital where her ailments were claimed to have been caused by a natural spirit, something more akin to a fairy and not a demon. That's when another important nun would enter the story, Marie Catherine of St. Augustine. She did not believe it was something as innocent as a fairy. She still believed it was a demon, caused by witches still living out on the fringe of the colony. She would begin to try getting rid of the demon herself, which quit attacking Barbe and began attacking Marie, so much to the point that it left her arm full of bruises, always trying to get her to question her faith. She would do everything she could to try to cast the demon out, but it never worked, until she got an idea. See, in 1662, a missionary named Jean de Brebeuf would suffer a terrible fate. After spending years working with the local indigenous peoples, he was kidnapped in a raid by the Iroquois, who then tortured and killed him. He was later canonized by the Catholic Church for all the work he had done in the New World, but that's getting a little bit off the subject. What's important is that his remains were brought back to Quebec, where his name had already grew in fame. They would boil his bones and lye, which would then become relics. Some were sent to France, others were kept in New France. One of these was a rib, and Marie's idea was to take that rib and place it against Barbe's body in an effort to get rid of the demon. According to 3 witnesses, her body began to contort and the demon screamed in pain because the rib of this venerated holy man was burning the demon. Marie then commanded the demon to leave the body, and although it refused at first, it could no longer take it. And then something came out of Barbe's mouth, something like breath, but visible, and then vanished. Barbe then began to cry and pray. The possession was over. After this, she basically lived a fairly normal life. But what do we make of this story? One that was documented so well, and by reputable people. It should be no surprise that most think that she was either mentally ill or just under a lot of stress. Colonial life was very difficult. There was a lot of labor, a very cold climate in the winter, and she may have been depressed. The sudden visions were just stress reactions, maybe even brought by malnutrition, or she could have even had epilepsy or some kind of other disorder the 17th century colonists all associated with the devil. As far as Daniel goes, the family could have made up the whole story about him putting a curse on her, or about conjuring up the devil. He wasn't well liked anyways, and if Barbe was pretending to be possessed, it might deter Daniel's advances. Actually, maybe it would deter most of the men. She lived in a colony where the ratio was 12 men to 1 woman, and what better way to take yourself off the marriage market than to make everyone believe you are possessed. And that brings us to the end of this installment of the Canadian Unsolved Mysteries. I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye, and good night.